We are live.
Your Excellencies, Ambassador and Representative of the States, ladies and gentlemen, and to those who is following us online, especially from inside Syria, a warm greeting. Thank you very much for your interest and time. I'm Fadl Abdelghani, the Director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and this is the annual international event that we have been organizing with the DRL for nearly 10 years about Syria on the sideline of the UN General Assembly. Despite the decline in international interest in Syria in favor of the other conflicts, such as Ukraine and the war on Gaza, Syria remains one of the worst humanitarian crises in the modern times and continue to produce more refugees, with nearly 7 million refugees and 6 million displaced people, meaning that half of the Syrian population is outside of their homes. The political transition to the democratic state, as demanded by millions of Syrians, that not succeeded, and they have paid a heavy price. This demand is still strongly present in Sweden and Northwest and Northeast. Is the main, and it's the main goal of all of our work, to transition Syria from the authoritarian rule of Assad family, which has continued since 1970, to a democratic government. This event will not have been possible without the support of the US Department of State, especially the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Many thanks to Sophia, Razi, Mariam, and Dream for their efforts. And also to the sponsoring countries, the United States, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Qatar, and the UK and Canada. Your sponsorship of this event means a lot to us, and sending message to the all Syrians that your countries are still concerned with the Syrian crisis. I hope the discussion will be useful and can build on it. I now give the floor to our moderator, Emma. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Fadl. Thanks a lot to the Syrian Network for Human Rights for gathering us here once again. Always appreciate the opportunity to all get together. And to the 7 countries who have sponsored this event: the US, the UK, Canada, Qatar, the Netherlands, Germany, and France. It's really fantastic to have such broad state representation so many years into this brutal conflict. And of course, our wonderful civil society representatives who will speak as well. And of course, thanks to everyone who's attending both in person during a very busy Ongo week and online, whether they're on the webinar, social media. Thank you again for your attention and your interest. I'm Emma Beals, by the way, a longtime friend of all Syrians who are working towards a safe and dignified life and country. Nearly 14 years of violence have taken place since the original uprising in Syria in 2011. And that violence and oppression, of course, began a long time before the war started. It's absolutely gutting to be back here again after so many years discussing the same things with so little progress, especially as the noise grows about refugee return and normalization and all of these things, when the war hasn't ended and the conditions that underpinned the war in the first place have not changed. However, without further ado, we've got a lot to get through, and we are going to finish on time because there are some important high-level meetings that folks need to get to after this. So I will hand it, without further ado, over to our first speaker, Dr. Dafna Rand, the US Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, who is going to deliver some official opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you to our organizers and our friends. I'm in the category of someone who was here at the very first year, 10 years ago, come to think of it, at UNGA when we first had this event. And it is very sad that we're here again, but important that we continue to meet, not just once a year, but across the year. I am honored to be back nonetheless, and I'm particularly thrilled that I'm joined by so many like-minded representatives of countries: UK, Germany, France, Canada, the Netherlands, closer, okay, the the Netherlands, Qatar, and the SNHR, of course, that has been an incredibly brave example of courage, persistence, and strategy, and has found and continue this critical work. So I'll say a little bit more about SNHR and your colleagues. I also want to thank Mariam Maz, who's here, for joining us today. Mariam, we are deeply honored that you're here with us. There you are. Okay. We're honored that you're here with us to share your father's story. I'm imagining that it's quite hard, but we thank you and the rest of your family for your sacrifice. We will not rest until those responsible for his death are brought to justice. I just want you to know how committed we are to that piece of accountability. So March of 2024, as you all know, marked 13 very long years since the Assad regime began its violent suppression of peaceful protests in Syria. Maybe that sounds like a small number, but think about it. I have an almost 14-year-old born that month, March 2020, in March 2011. And she is a full thriving teenager with a phone, as tall as I am now. And the world's population has grown by more than 1 billion people in that time. That's how much world history we've had since March 2011. And it's more than a quarter of my entire life. Many people in this room, it's half their lives. It's a very long time of unending brutality and abuses by the Assad regime that continue until this very day. 5,000 days later, 5,000 days of arbitrary detentions, disappearances, tortures, and extrajudicial killings. 5,000 long days of systemic torture to punish by the regime, to punish its critics and to terrorize innocent civilians. Over the course of this conflict, more than 15,000 people are reported to have died due to torture in Syria, with the regime responsible for almost all of them. Were they still alive today, those men, women, and children could almost fill Madison Square Garden right here in New York City, the O2 Arena in the UK, some British friends here who know about the O2 Arena, the Rotterdam Ahoy in the Netherlands, the Olympiahalle in Germany. I someday hope to go to all these big places, and the Sastel Center in Canada, or the Luise Arena in Qatar. So this, for global perspective, these are big places, and think about that scale of people we've lost, 15,000 people. So my first point to all of you, and if you remember nothing else from today, I want you to remember 3 points, and this is the first one. These abuses are not a relic of the past. They are continuing every day. In this year alone, 2024, SNHR, one of our hosts today, has documented 551 people in Syria who were killed by parties to the conflict, over 65 of whom died due to torture, including children and women, So let's take stock of what the international community and Syrians themselves working together have been able to achieve when it comes to accountability for these horrific and ongoing violations. And we should take stock as well as what we have failed to achieve and be honest and self-critical. Of course, we can applaud the pending case against Syria and the ICJ, and my colleagues will talk more about the legal suit. Yet even since the ICJ issued provisional measures last November, we continue to see reports of the regime unjustly arresting hundreds and torturing scores of people. And again, in terms of progress, we welcome the UN General Assembly's establishment of the IIM, which is the Independent Institution of Missing Persons in Syria. And we have continued to use our diplomatic power here in the United States to urge all parties to engage with this body, this UN body, the IAMP, in good faith, so that families can get answers about their loved ones who are missing. They at least deserve the information about the status and fate of their loved ones. And I urge all other governments here in this room to continue putting pressure on all parties to the conflict to at least work with the IAMP on this important issue of missing persons. So we continue to support in the United States actions by governments to sanction and restrict officials implicated in torture and other violations. We believe that the accountability really matter. And just a few weeks ago, to mark the International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances, the US imposed visa restrictions on 14 Syrian regime officials for their involvement in their repression of Syrians. These were officials widely associated with enforced disappearances. And these are just but the latest in a series of actions that we in the United States have taken to make clear that human rights violators are not welcome in the United States, And we will continue to identify other regime officials who have carried out repression. This is just one of our steps. We know it might seem like a small step, but we believe it is a deterrent and it is an important recognition within the Syrian officials and the government to call out and to shame these individuals. And we will continue to promote other forms of accountability. The second important point that I hope you take home is the importance of continuing to lend our support to civil society organizations that are supporting accountability, such as SNHR, but also the rest of civil society that has flourished against all odds across Syria in every part, in every way, speaking to the courage and the activism and the ingenuity of the Syrian people to continue to build civil society across 13 years of conflict. Many of these NGOs are documenting atrocities, assisting victims and survivors, gathering information. And other NGOs and other sectors are providing civil defense and providing social services where none are being offered by the state. Many of the civil society in the documentation sphere are trying to determine the status, the fate, the whereabouts of the 155,000 missing and unjustly detained persons. These groups and individuals are our partners, and we look to you not just for collaboration, but for your guidance and your recommendations, and frankly, what we can do diplomatically to elevate this issue beyond your work on the ground towards the high level of official diplomacy. And so the third obvious point that I want to echo, and I want you to take home to your host governments and to wherever you come and go home to, is the importance of continuing to pressure the regime and not to allow the world to return to normal and to cozy up to this brutal regime. There's many, many things we all can do united. We cannot turn the page and forget these 13 years of atrocities. And we must recognize that it is clear that the conditions do not exist in Syria for the voluntary, safe, and dignified return of refugees. There's pressure right now on many of the hosting governments to return the refugees, but the conditions do not allow for it. And as human rights minded and respecting countries, we need to ensure that that message is heard. Those who return to Syria are reporting a significant risk of abuses upon their return, including unjust detention, enforced disappearance, torture, and sexual violence. The fate of Ahmed Samer al-Hulali typifies the ongoing brutality of the Assad regime. Ahmed was a refugee in Lebanon. He was detained and tortured upon his return to Syria and eventually died this past July, brutally, when he was returned and he was arrested at the hands of the regime. Again, the Syria to which Ahmed returned obviously was neither safe nor dignified. So in conclusion, it is clear that Syrians today are continuing to suffer horrific human rights violations and abuses 13 years after the start of this revolution and this conflict as it's endured so brutally. And as a result, it is our duty, it is our responsibility as the international community to be clear that we will remain steadfast, unified, and committed to holding accountable the perpetrators and to continuing to use our diplomatic might, our multilateral organizations to raise the issues of abuse, the human rights violations, of missing persons, of torture, etc. Let me close by remarking on the humility of those who've worked on it, the persistence, the courage of those who are on the ground every day, risking their lives. We are so grateful and have so much respect for those members of civil society who continue to organize and work with victims and survivor groups. Thank you for continuing to share the painful work that you do with us. And we acknowledge the mental and emotional toll that comes after so many years of doing this. So we are here for you. We are listening. We are with you. We support you. And we will continue to fight alongside you. Thank you very much.
So much, Assistant Secretary. We'll turn now to the panelist with the job title most likely to inspire a character in the Marvel Universe, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Beth Van Schaack. And she will deliver some remarks from the United States.
Thank you, Emma. It's so funny that you say that because whenever a new person joins our team, they actually get a Justice League mug full of dark chocolate. So we do see ourselves a little bit in that role. So thank you for that. And thank you so much, Dafna, for outlining things so succinctly and yet in such a difficult way. And thank you to everyone for being here and to the organizers. It's both inspiring, but also somewhat sad to be here again, having this conversation in, I think, the same exact room as we were before. Same exact room, yeah. But there have been some developments, and I'd like to talk about a few of those here, which I hope will inspire some hope, even in the face of really entrenched impunity and Russia's continued blockages of any measures of any consequence before the UN Security Council on behalf of its client state of Syria. As Dafna mentioned, torture and arbitrary detention have a very long history in Syria. They did not begin with the revolution in 2011, and so we want to acknowledge that, but it did enter a sort of industrial grade scale following the revolution. Nothing demonstrates that more than the Caesar photos, which were secreted out from Syria by an individual whose job it was to record the death of individuals in custody. And those bodies in those photos show the harsh treatment that those individuals received, not only physical harm to their bodies, but also their emaciated state, that they were clearly subjected to horrific conditions of detention. And it's so inspiring that some of our European colleagues have had the creativity to step forward and to accuse the state of Syria under the Torture Convention for this policy and practice of torture. And I know we'll hear more about that today. SNHR has reported that there are still 150,000 at a minimum who are still missing. We assume that some of them may be dead, but some of them may still be detained. And if they are detained, it's fair to say that they are probably subject to various forms of psychological and physical torture. So we must keep them in our hearts and keep working on their behalves. The COI recently, we heard the anecdote of this one individual, but the Syrian Commission of Inquiry recently reported additional cases of individuals who would return to Syria who were subjected to detention and torture. So it's clearly not a safe moment for people to come back because they are often retaliated against for having left the country. The multifaceted crisis within Syria has generated a really creative set of accountability responses, due in part to the fact that the Security Council has been blocked by Russia. There was an attempt in 2014 to refer to the matter to the International Criminal Court that failed with the double veto by Russia and Syria. And so as a result, we've had forced creativity to find other available venues to utilize in order to press for justice. We have been trying to support many of these institutions, including the COI that I mentioned, the IIIM that Dafna has mentioned. This is devoted to being, in a sense, a clearinghouse of information, but also starting to analyze that information to a criminal law standard and then supporting national proceedings in national courts that are happening around the world. We're supporting the IIIM with information sharing and also supporting them financially to enable them to do their important work. We've also worked with a number of, with the UNITAD, which is unfortunately shutting its doors, but some of their work on ISIL crimes will have a crossover with respect to what was happening, particularly in northern Syria. And so we're working to make sure that those holdings remain available for national prosecutors who might be bringing cases in their own national systems. And we may have reached a breakthrough this year, this week at UNGA, in order to create a sort of dual mechanism, one within Iraq itself to respond to requests for information on a bilateral basis, but also maintaining some of those holdings within the United Nations itself. We've had a couple of high-profile cases in our own system. I'll just tick through them quickly. One of the four Beatles, if you remember, these were British-born individuals who joined ISIL, who committed torture and arbitrary detention against a number of individuals, including 26 hostages in Syria. One of them went to justice before the United States courts. Others are being prosecuted elsewhere, and one was killed. Also, most recently, the Samir al-Sheikh case, some may have heard of in the Central District of California. This is an immigration case, which may be puzzling to some observers, but understand that when an individual enjoys an immigration benefit in the United States, they often have to fill out a number of forms, which ask them questions about whether or not they have participated in the persecution of others. And he very dutifully clicked the button no on all of these measures, never worked in a prison, never participated in harm to other individuals. Those representations to our government have been proven to be false, or at least those are the allegations. And so he will be prosecuted for immigration fraud. But evidence of his mistreatment of individuals in custody when he was head of Adra prison prior to the revolution will be put on. So witnesses and others will be able to testify about their understanding of his role in the mistreatment of individuals at that prison or while he was governor of Deir ez-Zor. So that's a case to continue to watch. We also have the ability to sue, for individuals, victims have the ability to sue Syria itself as a state under our Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. This removes immunity from states that have been designated state sponsors of terrorism, as Syria has been. So we've had two cases, one, Obada Mzayek, whose case is going forward now. He alleges that he was detained and tortured at the Air Force Intelligence Branch at the Meze Military Airport. That case is ongoing. It's recently been unsealed. And then we have the case of Marie Colvin, who was the intrepid war correspondent, won a $300 million judgment against Syria for her extrajudicial killing while trying to cover the war in Syria and give voice to Syria's victims. But I want to give real credit to our friends in Europe, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany. All of them have played host to really important cases involving human rights abuses in Syria. Regime figures, members of ISIL, and also individuals associated with other armed groups. They've showed some real creativity, leadership, and perseverance in pursuing these cases, and I think in many respects have inspired other nations to explore how to activate their universal jurisdiction statutes, which give them extraterritorial jurisdiction over acts of torture in keeping with the Torture Convention. Many states have incorporated those prohibitions and those jurisdictional regimes into their codes, but they haven't activated them yet. And I think our European friends are really serving as an inspiration. The landmark case of Anwar Arslan in Germany, the first conviction of a Syrian official for crimes against humanity, including killing, torture, rape, and sexual assault. And then an ongoing case in Germany against Ala M, who was a doctor and who's also accused of mistreating individuals who should have been receiving proper medical care. I know we'll hear a little bit more about the torture case moving forward before the International Court of Justice, but just want to note that that case also, I think, has inspired additional cases to be filed by states under international human rights treaties that give jurisdiction to the ICJ for cases around disputes concerning the interpretation of those treaties. So just yesterday, it's a blur, Unga, I think it was yesterday, Germany and other states announced that they were going to pursue a matter under CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And I don't think that would have happened but for Germany, the Netherlands and Canada stepping forward and pursuing this case under the Torture Convention and showing that it can be done and calling these regimes to account. These are not criminal matters, they're state responsibility matters, but ultimately that may be where responsibility lies, and there may be an opportunity to generate reparations in the context of that case. So while this situation has inspired a lot of creativity, we know that it's a very patchwork approach, and there's much that needs to be done. There is a new initiative that my team is participating in this week, in fact, in The Hague. It's a civil society-driven effort to think creatively about the use of chemical weapons, and particularly focused on Syria and the multiple, I think the United States has counted at least 50 incidents in which the regime used chemical weapons against its own citizens. And so that team of states representing a cross-regional group of states will be thinking about how to push accountability for chemical weapon use in national courts and international fora, et cetera, in partnership with the OPCW. So that's a new initiative. The attention has not been lost. That's an important norm that deserves our support and fortification. So as Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, I too stand with you. We are looking for creative ways, and I look forward to continuing this conversation and partnership. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I did actually attend the Alexandria trials. I had a personal stake in them. So thank you for pursuing that. But I found it to be truly transformative experience, and I certainly won't rest until all Syrians have the same opportunity to pursue justice and the power that it has on individuals. We're going to zip across the Atlantic now. And Isabelle Rome, France's ambassador for human rights, is going to deliver an intervention for us. Over to you.
I speak French. Mesdames et messieurs, les représentants des missions permanentes des États-Unis, du Canada, de l'Allemagne, du Royaume des Pays-Bas, du Qatar et du Royaume-Uni auprès des Nations Unies, mesdames et messieurs, les représentants du réseau syrien pour les droits de l'homme et de la société civile syrienne, mesdames et messieurs du Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme. Je remercie la mission Je remercie la mission permanente des États-Unis ainsi que le réseau syrien pour les droits de l'homme pour l'organisation de cet événement parallèle consacré aux violations des droits de l'homme et aux actes de torture systémiques auxquels sont confrontés les Syriens. Cet événement est l'occasion d'explorer comment la communauté internationale peut faire progresser les efforts de justice et de responsabilisation des auteurs de crimes en Syrie. Je rappelle le soutien de la France en faveur de la prohibition absolue de la torture et de la reconnaissance du besoin de justice des victimes. Aujourd'hui, 174 États sont partis à la Convention contre la torture et autres peines ou traitements cruels, inhumains ou dégradants. Et nous appelons à son universalisation et à son plein respect. Cette année, nous commémorons les 13 ans du soulèvement du peuple syrien en faveur de la liberté, de la dignité et du respect des droits de l'homme. Alors que des centaines de milliers de civils ont été tués depuis le début du conflit, la répression menée par le régime de Bachar el-Assad perdure à travers le recours à la torture. Selon le réseau syrien pour les droits de l'homme, depuis le début du conflit en 2011, plus de 15 000 personnes, dont près de 200 enfants et plus de 100 femmes, ont été tuées après avoir été soumises à des actes de torture par le régime syrien, mais aussi par des acteurs non étatiques. La commission d'enquête indépendante internationale sur la République arabe syrienne a publié un rapport en juillet 2023 sur la torture et les mauvais traitements en Syrie entre 2020 et 2023 qui met en lumière des schémas répandus de traitements dégradants, inhumains ou cruels, ainsi que de torture, mais aussi des disparitions forcées. Ces pratiques de torture par le régime syrien constituent un des facteurs empêchant la mise en place des conditions nécessaires à un retour sûr et digne et volontaire des réfugiés en Syrie. La France condamne le régime syrien qui torture et tue ses détracteurs, mais aussi des défenseur des droits de l'homme, des journalistes, des professionnels de la santé et des personnes déplacées. Je réaffirme l'engagement de la France dans la lutte contre l'impunité, qui est l'une de nos priorités sur le dossier syrien. Notre action s'articule autour de 4 axes. Nous soutenons les mécanismes onusiens et internationaux, comme le mécanisme international indépendant et impartial, ainsi que la commission d'enquête indépendante et internationale. La documentation des crimes perpétrés en Syrie est essentielle pour les enquêtes et les poursuites. Nous saluons l'établissement de l'institution indépendante des Nations Unies pour les personnes disparues en Syrie en juin 2023, qui soutient les victimes et leurs familles. Deuxièmement, nous travaillons pour garantir la responsabilité pénale individuelle pour les crimes commis à l'international et soutenons le travail des cours internationales et nationales. Des procédures judiciaires sont en cours en France. La justice française peut poursuivre les coupables des crimes. Troisièmement, nous condamnons l'utilisation par le régime syrien d'armes chimiques contre sa population. Il y a 3 ans, nous avons soutenu la décision de l'Organisation pour l'interdiction des armes chimiques de suspendre les droits de la Syrie et avons lancé le partenariat international contre l'impunité pour l'utilisation des armes chimiques qui rassemble 40 États et l'Union européenne. Quatrièmement, nous soutenons les organisations de la société civile qui luttent contre l'impunité, comme le réseau syrien des droits de l'homme. Nous avons remis l'année dernière le prix franco-allemand pour les droits de l'homme et l'état de droit à Fadel Abdoul-Ghani, directeur du réseau syrien pour les droits de l'homme. Mesdames et messieurs les membres du réseau syrien des droits de l'homme, la pertinence de vos travaux n'a jamais été aussi prégnante. Je salue les immenses efforts des défenseurs des droits de l'homme et des ONG. Ils risquent leur vie pour documenter les crimes commis en Syrie et porter la voix des victimes. Je les assure de notre soutien. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Ambassador, for those remarks. We're moving on now to Luise Amtsberg, the German Federal Government Commissioner for Human Rights Policy and Humanitarian Assistance, who will deliver Germany's intervention.
Thank you very much. Thank you also for organizing this event, this timely event. And thank you also for inviting me again. So I remember very well last year, and that we also highlighted what has been achieved, but also stated that so much is still ahead of us. And I think we will come to the same result today, but the commitment you can feel in the room from all the states, I think this is also very important to mention, that this has not been, gone, it's still there. So the importance of this event cannot be understated after 13 years. And I also feel the same. I can't imagine. I mean, it's 13 years. I started being a politician back then. So it's a long time. And I think that we all didn't know what will happen. And this situation after so many years became more and more clear what has happened in Syria. And it's so important that we will not stop like fighting for accountability because it's needed. So this event is extremely timely also in a world where we are facing an increasing number of conflicts. You have mentioned it before. We must continue to retain our focus on and support for the Syrian people. And the Syrian people who are suffering, still suffering after years of war, conflict, insecurity, and still displacement. And I would like to thank the colleagues and also the dedicated personnel here, professionals who have brought us together to have a discussion and exchange also the human rights situation in Syria, and to shed a light on the atrocities that, and this is important, still continue to happen. So justice and accountability are the basis for any lasting solution in Syria, despite all of the evidence which has been gathered. Not a single perpetrator of the horrible crimes committed in Syria has brought to justice at international level. So reports continue to detail harrowing accounts and evidence of torture and other grave human rights violations in Syria. During the first 6 months of this year alone, 43 individuals, including children, have lost their lives due to torture in detention centers in Syria. Findings have also shown that those arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared in detention centers are subjected to sexual and gender-based violence. Stories continue to emerge of families who do not know the whereabouts of their relatives, or who simply do not know if they are alive or dead. There is nothing normal about this situation. And until this changes, no normalization can happen. So it is Germany's imperative to continue to support all international accountability efforts. We made that very clear, those of the international, impartial and independent mechanisms for Syria, those of the Commission of Inquiry, those of civil society organizations and relatives of the victims, to ensure that those responsible for torture, killing, and other atrocities in Syria will ultimately face justice. We also strongly support the implementation of the independent institution on missing persons. Germany welcomes steps taken to date to set up the mechanisms and to support the search for the missing and families of survivors. And I think it is a glimmer of hope for Syrian families looking for their missing relatives when we really make that clear. At least 123,000 Syrians from all over the country and from all political and religious affiliations are still missing. I mean, this number is unbearable. When we talk about the victims' families, we are talking about women and men who lost sons and That is good, because I want everyone to hear this on missing persons, and its need to be effective. Germany will continue to work with you to ensure that your voices and contributions remain central to the process. This very dark and troubling picture. Besides that, there is still hope. And I think it is a good opportunity to also mention this. In the absence of international justice, national jurisdictions continue to take measures to hold those responsible for these crimes. And I think it is a good shared responsibility, and stepping in if on other levels it's not working for what reason ever is also the responsibility of states who have committed to the international system. So I don't want to get too much into detail, because a lot of things have been already said. But of course, we could manage former officials of the Syrian regime's repressions apparatus, members of Daesh and other terrorist groups are standing before courts or have already been sentenced, as it was the case in Germany and more recently in Sweden and France. Universal jurisdiction continues to be an effective and proportionate tool for pursuing accountability for the most serious crimes under international law. However, given the sheer scope of human rights violations in Syria, we must continue to press for all tangible ways to hold perpetrators accountable, and this is one way. And still, we have to ask, what can we do better, and what also we can do differently? And you all will be aware that these are some of the questions that are currently being discussed by those who remain committed to finding a political solution to the Syria crisis. Although discussions remain ongoing, this is why I refer to this. I'm referring to this because it is in the room. We can be very clear that this is not the time to re-engage with Assad without any meaningful political progress. We remain steadfast. No normalization, no reconstructing that benefits the regime, no lifting of sanctions. The only lasting solution for the people of Syria must come from UNSC Resolution 2254, And in this regard, we continue to fully support the UN Special Envoy Peterson and his efforts to reignite the political process. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to just shed a light on some of the discussed issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Commissioner. I will pass now attempt not to create a diplomatic incident in the process to Guusje Korthals, the Netherlands Director for North Africa and the Middle East.
Yes, thank you very much. And I know I have an impossible name, but it's also an icebreaker. It's the G that most of the Arabic speakers can pronounce, the Guusje, but you did a wonderful job. Thank you. Well, for me, it's the first time I'm here in this room, but I know that many of my predecessors have been at this table. And 13 years ago, when this started, I was working in our human rights department, actually working on justice and accountability for Syria together with the US and Schaack, as we called it then. Yes, long time ago. So it's a bit sad to be here today, but at the same time, it gives us hope, since it also shows our perseverance in continuing to fight for this. So thank you very much for organizing this, to the US and to the Syrian Network for Human Rights, because fighting impunity and accountability for the committed crimes are fundamental in a future peaceful Syria. Although some believe that accountability is unhelpful in finding a political solution in the current complexity, we are convinced that accountability is essential for a start of reconciliation, crucial for building sustainable social fabric of society, as there can be no peace without justice. And that's why we, it was mentioned before, joined by Canada, have invoked Syria's responsibility for human rights violation under international law, under the UN Convention Against Torture, holding Syria accountable for these violations. Almost a year ago, the International Court of Justice issued a provisional measures order directing the Syrian regime and those under its control to prevent torture and ill treatment and to preserve all related evidence. And I remember the day that happened because many of the victims and survivors were there. And it was really, I think it was a very special day. It's also a day to remind us that this is still going on. The order was long overdue, given the countless reports and witness testimonies documenting the Syrian regime's systematic use of torture and ill treatment. As was mentioned before, so many thousands of Syrians have been tortured, murdered, sexually assaulted, forcibly disappeared, and subjected to chemical weapons attacks. The latest report of the Commission of Inquiry serves as a stark reminder that these brutal practices continue every day. And we're deeply disturbed by the recent findings of this commission that also the returning Syrians being detained and disappeared. The regime continues to obstruct, as was mentioned before as well, efforts to locate their arbitrarily detained relatives, often demanding bribes for information, visits, or releases. These human rights abuses must come to an end, and justice and truth must prevail. Victims and survivors have waited long enough. Achieving accountability requires a united front, and we must work together and with institutions like the Commission of Inquiry and the IIIM. These mechanisms have proven invaluable in ensuring the crimes committed in Syria are and will not be forgotten. Its work in collecting, consolidating, preserving and analyzing evidence and preparing case files is crucial in the fight against impunity. And yet, despite this vital work and despite the continued funding under the UN program budget, IIIM is left scrambling for additional resources each year to fulfill its mandate and to meet the increasing number of requests for information from member states. I know many at this table are already contributing, but for those online listening, it's recorded. We call on all member states to consider to support IIIM's important work through voluntary contributions. Equally important are the tireless efforts of the Syrian civil society organizations in this pursuit of justice and accountability. Time and again, they ensure that Syrian voices are heard through fact-based advocacy, serving as intermediaries for victims and documenting vital evidence, also in support of mechanisms like the IIIM. We applaud you for your steadfastness and for your courage in the continuous fight for accountability and justice inside and outside Syria. Although we're nowhere near the end of impunity, so many important steps have been taken on the road to justice with proceedings, as was also mentioned before, in France, Germany, and Sweden. These national efforts complement and strengthen the multilateral efforts. So in concluding, both the international and national tools should therefore be put on the table to support accountability efforts. And for that, we need perseverance, we need a united front, and we need the funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director, for those remarks. I think it's fantastic that joining us today, we have a representative from a regional state. So we're really glad to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm very happy to introduce Faisal bin Abdullah Al-Hanzab, Qatar's Special Envoy of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who will deliver Qatar's remarks.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to be here today and to be in front of our colleagues and audience and all of you. And, I'm a representative of Qatar. It's the only country that in Arab League that didn't get back and normalize the relation with the regime because of what we are about now. So we are glad to once again to work with the partners and co-sponsors for this event and shed the light on the human rights violation in Syria. We also recognize the indispensable work of the Syrian Network for Human Rights and has been undertaking for the years and documented that and to raise awarenesses of these important issues. We thank you a lot. This has been a subject of deep concern for the international community and including my country, which has been repeatedly emphasized the commitment and upholding human rights anywhere, including during its current fifth term as a member of Human Rights Council. This is also why the state of Qatar has partnered always with the United States and main co-sponsors of the annual General Assembly, a resolution on the situation of human rights in the Syrian Republic. Human rights violations and abuses remains to this day a major concern in the context of Syrian crisis affecting our Syrian brothers and sisters. Among the most serious issues are forced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, sexual violence, and challenges facing women and girls, and the systemic use of torture and inhuman treatment, including torture in prisons, which has caused the death of tens of thousands of people, including children, and all of that documented. In addition, the issue of missing person is another cause of concern, of a tremendous suffering, with an estimated 100,000 people still missing. This is why State of Qatar supported the General Assembly, a resolution that established the independent institution of missing person in Syrian Arab Republic, with a view of clarifying fate and whereabouts of the missing persons and providing support to victims, survivors, and families. These abuses have been documented by the United Nations reports, such as the report of Commission of Inquiry, and by national and international human rights organizations. We must condemn violations, especially the most egregious violations by whomsoever they are committed, and under whatever pretext. Addressing these issues is essential and indispensable for resolving the Syrian crisis and resolving the problem of refugees and internally displaced persons, especially given the report that returning refugees are subjected to interrogation under torture. The international community must continue to advance efforts to uphold justice and accountability for the crimes and serious violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and support the tools available for this purpose. The State of Qatar supported the establishment as well and operationalization of the international independent investigation mechanism, proceeding from a conviction that upholding the principles of justice and accountability is essential for reconciliation and, by extension, for lasting peace. The mechanism has been achieving concrete results with an increasing number of requests for assistance from different competent in Syria. I would also like to reiterate that providing assistance to address the humanitarian crisis has been a priority for my country, which continues to be a leading provider of assistance. Finally, the best way forward of this dire situation that we are discussing in this meeting is surely the comprehensive settlement of the Syrian crisis. This settlement must be achieved through a political process leading to a political transition in accordance with the Geneva I Communique and Security Council Resolution 2254, realizing the aspiration of the Syrian people and preserving the sovereignty, independence, and unity and territorial integrity of Syria. I thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Special Envoy. Stephen Hickey from the United Kingdom has been momentarily disposed, and his delightful colleague is very graciously stepping in to read his remarks for us from the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not Stephen Hickey, but hi all. I'm Alexandra Bradowitz. I cover human rights here at the UK mission to the UN. Is that better? Yeah. Let me start by thanking the Syrian Network for Human Rights and its sponsors for convening today's event and bringing us all together. I also want to use this opportunity to applaud the many Syrian civil society organizations who have worked tirelessly in pursuit of justice and accountability for the Syrian people. Their steadfast commitment in advocating for all those who have suffered horrific abuses since the start of the conflict is truly commendable. Discussions and events like today really matter because, and as we've heard from others on the panel, after 13 years of conflict, the Assad regime has shown no sign of behavioral change and continues to detain, torture, and kill its own people. We need only to look at the latest UN Commission of Inquiry's report from this month to see these abuses laid bare. The report provides a harrowing insight into the continued use of arbitrary detention and torture by the regime. This includes first-hand accounts of detainees being subject to sexual and gender-based violence, including rape and appalling levels of brutality, whilst in the custody of the Military Intelligence Directorate. The Syrian people will continue to be detained for simply exercising their basic human rights, such as supporting peaceful protests. Once detained, they are regularly refused legal support, interrogated, and mistreated by a judicial system that lacks any independence. Meanwhile, the security services obstruct and extort family members who are simply trying to find their loved ones and make sure they are still alive. Not only is this behavior encouraged by the regime, but perpetrators are actively rewarded. In June this year, the Syrian-British Consortium released a report on the crimes committed by the National Union of Syrian Students at the University of Damascus between 2011 and 2013. It provides first-hand accounts of student union members assaulting fellow students and detaining them in the designated torture rooms before transferring them to the security services. Former members have since taken on senior roles within the regime, including representing Syria internationally. This systematic disregard for human life in Syria must stop. And we, the international community, must do everything we can to amplify the voices of the victims and stand up for the rule of law to ensure all perpetrators are held accountable. Again, that is why these discussions, bringing us all into the same room and making this commitment together, really matter. For our part, the UK remains committed to pursuing accountability in Syria. We are proud to have co-sponsored the UN General Assembly resolution to establish the UN international and independent mechanism in 2016. This mechanism has since gathered and shared extensive evidence about crimes committed during Syria's conflict. We are also proud of UK-funded partners such as the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which have played a vital role in documenting atrocities committed by Syrian actors. These include their work to secure over 1 million documents from within Syria, which has supported prosecutions in 13 countries. And lastly, we are pleased to have supported the UN General Assembly resolution last year, which established the Independent Institution on Missing Persons. We know this institution will play a vital role in clarifying the fate of over 100,000 missing Syrians, as well as supporting the victims, survivors, and their loved ones. Colleagues, we can only deliver on this important agenda when the international community stands united on these key issues. Therefore, I want to end by reiterating the need for keeping accountability on the agenda. We must continue calling on all parties in the Syria conflict to cease their horrific violations, cooperate meaningfully with the UN mechanisms, and fulfill their human rights obligations. Thank you.
so much. It's not easy to jump in, so we do appreciate you doing that. We're going to turn online now. We have a representative from our friends a little bit north in Canada, Dr. Martin LaRose, Canada's Director General for the Middle East Bureau, is going to deliver Canada's remarks. The screen's over here.
No, the problem from this side, not from you. Here is okay. No need to do anything. Let's go to Theo. Then why you fix it?
Okay, apologies. We seem to have a little problem with the sound from Canada. So while that's fixed, we might jump to Theo because we are short on time and we do have a lot of officials here who will need to leave promptly at 2:30, which may require us to jiggle things around a little. Theo, I wanted to turn to you and then we'll go back over the border. Theo is from the OHCHR. Can you describe to us the patterns of torture used in Syria, both by the regime and other parties? And how does that torture impact the arbitrarily detained and the forcibly disappeared in Syria? Over to you, Theo.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Can you hear me well? Great. I apologize. I'm sick, so my voice is very rocky. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for the Syrian Network for Human Rights and for the sponsors to have invited me for this important event. Of course, as you can imagine, answering those questions in an exhaustive way is not possible. I will do my best, and I also know we are short on time. But maybe I will start first by highlighting something that a lot of the previous speakers said, but I think describing properly the features and patterns of torture in Syria, what they have in particular for this conflict, as opposed to other conflicts, is really truly a part of what justice and the right to the truth means for the victims and their families. And sometimes too often, the reference to torture and the forms of torture practiced in Syria is just listed as part of the range of violations that happen in the conflict. But it is very important to be able to describe those patterns properly, because that's part of this right to the truth. That's a cruel irony, but I would also say, without getting technical, that what we witnessed in Syria over the past 13 years cover all the range of cases crafted in the definition of torture under the 1984 Convention. Be it to extract information, to punish people, to intimidate, and to discriminate in many different ways. And I think this is also part of describing those patterns, is to show how extensive the range of purposes of torture in Syria is. It's also, I think, very important, and it was recalled several times, that most of the torture in Syria happened in situation of detention, and in order to suppress and crush dissent. But I think it's very much important to remember how this industrial scale of torture in Syria is related to a system of detention, and in particular when it comes to the government, both official and most importantly unofficial places of detention. Another feature, I think, of torture in Syria is that it is rarely committed without being associated with a wide range of other violations and abuses, and as we said, in particular, enforced disappearance. Now, another very important part in describing torture should be that it is, of course, linked to arbitrary arrest and detention, but it is highly gendered in the context of Syria. Now, it is well known that the majority of victims are men, and there the purpose of torture is to crush dissent. But in addition to that, for example, for cases of sexual and gender-based violence as a form of torture against men, it is also meant to humiliate and cause stigma. Now, of course, as we discussed before, women have been tortured too, but it is also very important to remember that in Syria, for women, the mere fact of being detained brings stigma because of the suspicion that women would have been subjected to sexual and gender-based violence while being detained. So even if this had not happened, stigma is attached to the mere situation of being detained. Another important aspect of torture in Syria is that it is often described in relation to the conflict, but a lot of cases of torture happen with no link to the war at all, and also to a wide range of population, in particular, most recently, as we discussed, for people who return to Syria, being arrested and tortured for the mere fact of having fled and being perceived as opponents. Now, when it comes to the link between torture and other violations and violation and abuses, one feature, and the Syrian Network of Human Rights worked a lot on this in documenting death in custody as a result of torture. The OHCHR Syria office is currently finalizing a report on this very issue, and in particular on the impact of death in custody for families of people who died. And in that respect, the many ways this type of abuses and violation impact families is still, after 13 years of conflict, not fully documented. There is a wide range of challenges and obstacles faced by families, and these are ongoing violations that also need to be addressed. I would say, for the sake of accountability and the discussion around accountability, one thing that the office has been highlighting systematically is that families of people who are forcibly disappeared are also considered under international law victims of psychological torture, for the mere fact of the anguish and distress caused by the continuing uncertainty for those families. And this has been recognized by UN treaty bodies and other experts. But also, I think it's important to remember that victims, that families of missing relatives are also victims of violation of their own right to know the truth and to know what happened to their loved ones. And I think in that context, it is very important when we look at accountability, and it's been reminded a lot during this discussion. It's true that criminal accountability for the crime of torture is essential to achieve, but currently, with the case before the International Court of Justice, or even the review by the Human Rights Committee of Syria, are very important avenues for accountability, because at the end of the day, they are the avenues that be able to show the entire pattern of torture as a state enterprise, rather than just an aggregation of criminal individual behaviors. Thanks a lot again, and I'm very happy and honored to be addressing you today. Over to you.
Thank you, Theo. Do we have Canada on the line with sound? Yes? No? It appears we do not. We will move ahead and go back to Canada as soon as we are able. We are really lucky today to have our next speaker, and I'm so grateful to you for being here, Mariam. In June, the United States recognized the death of Majid Kamalmas. He was an American who was last seen in Syria at a regime checkpoint in 2017. And I'd like to talk to you as his daughter, who has obviously been affected in the way so many Syrian families have by having a loved one missing in detention, and the horror that really is. She's been an advocate for her father's release. And I'd love to hear more from you about your father's case and your family's hopes and your quest for accountability for his situation. Thank you, Mariam.
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak before you today. My name is Mariam Kamalmaz. I come here today as the daughter of Maj Kamalmaz, an innocent American father who was ripped away from his family, tortured and murdered by the Syrian government. Yet his case is not unique in Syria. There are hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children who have seen the same fate as my father. What made my father unique is his American citizenship and our ability to have our voices heard. My father was a humble, beautiful man, a grandfather to 14 grandchildren, a husband, a father, an uncle, and an only son to his 84-year-old mother, who is still alive till today. My father was an award-winning humanitarian, a psychotherapist, and a trauma expert. He was a healer with a large, beautiful heart to serve people in the most horrific situations. He traveled to countries who had experienced extreme forms of trauma from war and natural disasters such as Kosovo, Bosnia, Indonesia after the tsunami, and New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. His latest effort was in Lebanon, where he had opened 2 branches of his institute, IIPD, International Institute for Psychosocial Development, to treat refugees and anyone that walked through his door. My father grew up in the United States, and we were all born and raised here. We didn't have much to do with what was going on in Syria, besides my father continuing to do his work in Lebanon. Our hearts and prayers were with the innocent Syrians who were being tortured and killed, yet we lived far away, and we were untouched by the situation. However, on February 14, 2017, my father traveled to Syria to visit family and was considering opening a branch of his institute, International Institute for Psychosocial Development, to treat those inside of Syria. After confirming with lawyers in Syria that his name was clear to enter and unwanted by the Syrian government, he felt safe to enter and took a taxi from Lebanon into Syria without any issues. He arrived safely at a family member's house in Damascus and called my mother to let her know he had arrived and all was well. The very next day, within less than 24 hours of his arrival, he was picked up by a driver who would drop him off to visit friends. They were stopped at a temporary checkpoint where my father walked inside without any hesitation, confident he was an American and cleared to enter Syria safely. Little did he know that this checkpoint was actually set up to kidnap him and he would never see freedom again. We received the phone call from my father's friend who was waiting for him. He had asked if we had heard from my father, which we had not. Over the next few hours, the worst thoughts were running through our heads. Sorry. And the worst of them all was the thought of the Syrian government unjustly and wrongfully detaining him. We had heard the horror stories of torture and death. I'm sorry. Sorry. I think I have. And throughout the years, it's been really difficult that I've realized that I have like a chronic stress. We had heard horror stories of torture and death. The chances of survival were nearly impossible. Within a few hours, the worst news had arrived. My father's driver notified his friend exactly what we had feared the most. At that instant, I swore I would never back down until I exposed the Syrian government's corruption to the entire world for taking such a beautiful, kind-hearted man who had never done anything wrong and deserving of detainment. Little did I know we would never hear his voice or see him again. We immediately contacted the UN and the US State Department and were put in touch with consular affairs. We reached out to every connection we knew inside and outside of Syria. My entire family from different states traveled immediately to my house in Texas, where we gathered and brainstormed all different options and connections to find which branch my father was held in, and whatever the price of the ransom, to free him. As you know, that is the only way to release a prisoner, to pay a ransom. At the end of the day, it was a business. To detain innocent people and have their families scramble to gather and pay large amounts of money to free their loved ones. Yet we were ready to pay whatever the price would be to free my father and bring him home. We met with the Schaack ambassador in DC, who said she was planning to travel to Syria within a week and promised to find him. Soon after she left for Syria, she was radio silent and stopped replying to our emails. We never knew the reason. She never updated us on his whereabouts or condition. After 2 years of silently working to find and free him, we realized we were right back to where we had started. My father had literally disappeared within their prisons without a trace. The family members my father had planned to visit had passed away, and we had little family left inside Syria. We depended purely on the US government. Unfortunately, consular affairs were unproductive and had led us nowhere. They had sent multiple diplomatic notes to Syria, which were always unanswered. And yet this was their best strategy to occupy us with the delusion of productivity. In early 2019, with the help of SETF, Syrian Emergency Task Force, we decided to go public with my father's case, to broadcast it to the world and let the injustice be heard everywhere. Maybe there and then the Syrian government would finally admit to his fate. We pleaded for President Trump at that time to take action and do all that he can to bring our father home. Luckily, we were heard. The Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell and the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs finally stepped in and took on his case. We could now breathe a sigh of relief. My father was then included in all forms of negotiations with the Syrians. We started traveling to DC on a yearly basis, sometimes more. Meetings and phone calls were nearly on a daily basis. Ads were set up to find anyone that might know anything about him. Yet we were deceived by multiple scammers and even received death threats to kill us, our children, and our entire family. We were helpless and thousands of miles away with little to no information about him and very little trusted sources in Syria. After multiple attempts through the third-party connections, personal letters written from the heart by my family to the president of Syria, which went unrecognized, we continued to push the US government to do more and whatever it takes to free him and bring him home. Until May of this year, the unfortunate and horrific news was confirmed to us. After 7 long years of tirelessly looking for answers, the US government confirmed through highly credible information that my father had indeed passed away in the corrupt and brutal Syrian prison system. In May 2024, Mash Kamalmaz, a scholar, father, and man of God, was confirmed to be dead. My father never had a crime, trial, charges, or even a case to his name. Yet he wasn't allowed to contact family or have visitation of any sort. And even greater injustice was served when we were unable to receive his body for a proper burial, as his body may have been burned or thrown into a mass grave. All of these grievances have left us accountability from the Syrian government for the tragic kidnapping, disappearance, and torture, and horrendous death. How could we stay silent? A government that claims to be sovereign had denied him every single basic human right. His detainment as a whole was corrupt, immoral, and had no basis. In July of 2024, my family and I, with the help of SETF, filed a $70 million lawsuit in hopes to set a precedent that families and communities will no longer keep quiet. My father's story has pioneered the way for hundreds of thousands seeking justice and tens of thousands still to this day wrongfully detained in Syria. The death of an innocent American at the hands of a corrupt and evil government should not be overlooked. I call on the Department of Justice and the United States government to open a criminal case against the president of Syria and to further investigate the wrongful detention and murder of my father at the hands of the Syrian government. We must make it clear that we do not allow governments to murder innocent Americans and civilians. The tragedy of my father's death is part of a larger systemic issue. Hundreds of thousands of individuals have suffered severe human rights abuses under the Syrian regime. My father's case is not an isolated incident, but rather a stark example of a broader crisis that demands urgent attention. We must pass the Assad Anti-Normalization Act and work to prevent any form of international recognition and normalization to such an evil and corrupt regime. Our ongoing lawsuit and the call for accountability and plea for criminal case are not just about seeking answers for my father's death, but also about highlighting the extensive suffering experienced by countless others. The goal is to ensure that these abuses are not overlooked and that there is a concerted international effort to address them. The emotional toll on our family has been immense. My family has suffered tremendously and has taken a major toll on our physical and mental health. My father's passing is not only a profound personal loss, but also a powerful reminder of the urgent need to address these human rights abuses. By confronting these issues directly, we can honor my father, Maj Kamel Maz's legacy of compassion and work towards a future where such tragedies are prevented and human dignity is upheld. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. It was obviously extremely difficult, and I think it's so important for everyone, though, to remember why we're here and why we're doing this, and that these numbers and these sort of anecdotes about, you know, strangers far away, this is the effect, this is what it comes down to. And each of those people, the 15,000, the 120,000, has a whole family who's experiencing all of this alongside them as well. So the numbers are multiplied many times over. We do have, our officials do need to begin leaving. There is an important meeting about the disappeared, and people need to be able to get there. So I think that that's a good excuse for people to leave. It's in a meeting we do want them to attend because it's important work. So we're going to switch up the order. I'm going to go to very patient U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs, Natasha Franceschi, who's going to give the concluding remarks, but it's going to be a fake out because we're not going to conclude. We're going to go to our other speakers after that. So I'll pass the mic to you, and sorry about the timing.
First of all, Mariam, thank you very much for sharing with us your family's very powerful story today. Just a few words, because I think the focus of this should be on the victims' families and on the work that civil society is doing to shed light on the atrocities that have been committed and continue to be committed. So I just want to express my sincere gratitude to Fadel Abdelghani and the entire Syrian Network for Human Rights for helping us organize this very insightful and this critical event here today. Your organization's consistent efforts and perseverance in advocating for human rights in Syria, promoting justice and accountability, and laying the groundwork for democratic change, I think inspires hope for the victims of human rights abuses and their families. I don't want to take more time as an official here today. I want the focus to be on, again, the victims' families and on the work that civil society is doing on these very, very important issues. So I turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that intervention, and to the officials that have left and need to go, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you sponsoring the event, helping to organize it, for the work that you're doing, for being here, and for the work you're about to do, and working on the further on the agenda of finding information about those who are missing and detained within Syria. So if some people do need to leave, they're very welcome to. For those who do not need to leave, please stay with us. We have some further important interventions to continue. And I'm sorry that the timing has gone wildly over. I will take responsibility for that as the moderator. Do we have Canada on the phone? We do not have Canada on the phone. It appears that the Wi-Fi is down in Canada. So we will go now to our very esteemed civil society speaker to my left. Dr. Mahmoud Aswad from Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights. I want to talk about sexualized violence, which is another a very awful topic and so important. How is that weaponized in Syria? What more is needed to ensure adequate response for survivors, including women and children, and providing evidence for accountability in relation to that kind of violence and the violence against children in Syria? Dr. Aswad, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Fadl, for this opportunity. Actually, this is related to our work since we are specialized to document sexual violence and torture during the crisis. And this is something it's not easy to go through and to document. So weaponizing the sexual violence in Syria is not being random or opportunistic. It's instead of has been systematically weaponized as a form of control and intimidation, because they know our society and they know the stigma. This is the stigma. They are depending on the stigma. What happened after releasing? They are depending to destroy the person in front of their community. The Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights, they have documenting extensive cases of forced nudity among men, women, and children, as well as sexualized the torture in military detention centers. In every prison across Syria, survivors report sexual violence resulting in weaponized, widespread PTSD. This goes beyond individual perpetrator using rape for personal reason. This is a strategic and calculated strategic way to degrade and humiliate the survivors, detainees, tender survivors, impact their life and their future ability to form an intimate relationship and erode the community structure. This is very important. They planning for that. Examples include detainees being forced to perform sexual acts. Usually, this is under surveillance, as well as male detainees subjected to genital violence, designated to affect their fertility and sexual intimacy in the future. The involvement of children is as a witnesses or as a participating in this act shows the horrific extent of sexual violence, weaponization, and trying to use it very carefully. These atrocities point to the systematic use of sexual violence as a psychological weapon aimed at both individuals and broader society. For protection survivors, we need to protection survivors in Syria remain the huge issue for everyone. Especially given the limited resources. Now we are going more and more decreasing the resources for supporting the survivors, and also and widespread of trauma. This is need a lot of resources, but actually this is instead of that we have reducing the resources to provide these services for them. Our physicians highlight the lack of trauma-centered mental health services for men and children, especially, who are often overlooked in post-trauma care. Mental health support, specialized family counseling, and substance abuse treatment are critical, but there is a gap in access, for those people, especially the children and adolescents. Beyond clinical intervention, public education campaign about the human rights, sexual violence, crimes, and psychological and social impact of sexual violence are essential. And this is very important since we have we have experience dealing with this with the community, to raising awareness about through the community, and this is really decrease the stigma, decrease the rejection, and increase the ability to accept the survivors in their community. These initiatives can help reduce stigma, as I mentioned, reintegrate survivors into their community, and address a shame and guilt and despair that sexual violence survivors often feel. Additionally, economic and education support for the larger population of the internally displaced person and those living in the refugee camp in neighborhood country is necessary for building their lives and community. I will be short about the accountability and sexual violence. It should be, we should have in 4 levels. One is the ground level documentation, which we should continue with the documentation. It's not ended. We are not reaching the most of the survivors from the torture and sexual violence. This is really critical, and we should advocate for that. Building legal cases more and more, and this is give more trust for the survivor to keep going and to telling the story, especially after the normalization and decreasing the interest of the Syria. Publication and advocacy about what happened in Syria, and like what my colleague Maryam mentioned, we should highlight about what happened in Syria. We should advocate, and we should keep going to publish report, human rights report, the stories. And Syria, it's not safe for return, not safe for stay inside, not safe for. And we have still thousands of people, hundreds of thousands now in the prison or disappeared. The last one, we need to address culture and legal discrimination. This is very important. We need to work to make sure this is, because there is some root of the sexual violence, and we should work to eliminate this in the future. And we don't want our people in the future and our children to face the same issue that we have. So I will finalize this. It's very important, since we are our doctors. It's like every time they interview the survivors, especially recently, we start to document the child cases. It's really hard to listen to the documentation from the child and the woman, especially when the mother and the children at the same prison, and the children listen or see what happened to their moms or to others. So we need to work together to make sure this is not they are not stay in the prison now, and we need to release them, and we need to work to support them, to make them more strong, to speak about what happened to them, and to support their family, like what's going on with Maryam family. We need to give them this courage to speak and to support, and to let us to know more about what happened, to help them and to help others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aswad. It's important work that you guys are doing, documenting this particular and very pernicious element of the abuses that are happening in Syria. I want to ask Fadl a question. Finally, Fadl. Fadl Abdghani, of course, you all know, is the founder and head of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and the organization that is why we are here today. It's a very topical question for you. You know, people are talking about refugee return, you know, people are being forced back from Lebanon. There's a lot of chat about it. You know, maybe Syria's safe. Obviously, we've heard a lot today about why it isn't. But could you tell us a little about how the use of torture impacts returning refugees and IDPs, both inside and outside of regime-controlled areas?
Sure. Thank you very much, Emma, and for my colleagues. Maybe 3 points in not more than 5 minutes. I'm always the last speaker as a host. So yeah, okay. So the first point is that the torture ongoing, and we need to prove that actually. We don't have a single piece of evidence that it has stopped, and torture is genuinely linked to the arbitrary detention. Every arbitrary detainee is subjected to torture. Also, the majority of detainees, up to 70%, become forcibly disappeared. And we have evidence that the Syrian regime kills the forcibly disappeared and registered them as a dead in civil registry without informing their family. SNHR has more than 1,200 death certificate for forcibly disappeared person registered in the Syrian, registered by the Syrian regime in the civil registry without notifying their family. This is a large number, and the Syrian regime has approximately 94,000 forcibly disappeared person, many of whom may have died under torture. What I would like to say is that arbitrary detention has a very highly probability of leading to death under torture, and enforced disappearance are among the methods of torture. We have documented the killing of 15,393 Syrian citizens under torture from March 2011 until now at the hand of all parties. The Syrian regime responsible for 98% of them. The second point is the continuation of torture not only prevents refugees and ITPs from return, but also generates more refugees and ITPs, because the Syrian regime practices torture is a systematic manner which constitute crimes against humanity. Torture is a major reason behind the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Syrians, because its impact not limited to the individual or the family, but extend to the people of the neighbor or village, thus spreading a state of panic among the whole society. This is the goal of perpetrator, and this is a message they want to spread, that threatening a similar fate to society if it demands political change toward freedom and democracy. So we documented thousands of cases of arbitrary detention to whom those been when they back. So from 2014, when there is a hint of people start the refugees back, up to now we documented 4,714 cases arrest. A lot of them remain as a forced disappearance, 1,521 cases, including women and the children, including people who obtain what is called settlement paper, but they didn't benefit from it and were arrested and tortured. The third point is on November 16, 2023, the ICJ issued the resolution of percussion measures, and we have been monitoring the regime compliance with this decision, and we issued 3 reports. The third report, which was issued on 9 months after the court decision, we documented 756 cases of arbitrary arrest, and 659 of those had forcibly disappeared. So as I mentioned, the vast majorities of the arbitrary arrest become forcibly disappeared. And we have fear that those might die under torture. Finally, 7 European countries are afraid of receiving Syrian refugees on their lands after Lebanon's forcibly deported hundreds of Syrians to Cyprus. These countries believe that by restoring relation with the Syrian regime, the economic situation will improve and some of the refugees will return. To these countries and to everyone who wants to restore relation with the Syrian regime, I say that the economic situation is not the main reason behind the flying of Syrian, but rather the absence of judicial and legislative authority and the continuation of repression and torture. I think the question is not why refugees does not return from Turkey, Italy, the Czech Republic or elsewhere, but The question is why the displaced person who is in northwest or northeast Syria doesn't return to his home, which may be only half an hour driving from his tenant, instead of talking of refugees thousands of kilometers away. So my recommendation, actually, as long as the Syrian regime remains, arrest and torture will continue, because those are the most prominent tools of intimidation and control. All countries of the world, especially countries afraid from the flow of refugees, must push a political transition toward democracy system that respect human rights. Then millions of displaced people and refugees will return because they want to return. But it must be a return to a country with a democratic system, not return to country ruled by a brutal regime that killed citizens under torture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fadel, and thanks to all of you who have stayed with us for the whole event, which is wildly over time. Thank you so much to our 7 countries who sponsored this event and have spoken, the US, Canada. They didn't speak, but we can intuit their sentiment. I think they would be very mad about what's happening and support all of the endeavors to resolve these issues. The US, the UK, Canada, Qatar, the Netherlands, Germany, and France. Thank you so much to our esteemed civil society speakers, and of course, to you, Mariam, for sharing your important story and helping us to focus our minds on what's really important. Having a missing loved one leaves your heart outside of your chest every day. So it's not just those detained that are trapped. Everybody that loves them is trapped as well. And it's still ongoing. It's happening as we speak. Someone has been arrested in the course of this event. It's not a historical issue. We must keep working. We must stop more people being exposed to this violence and these dangers by forcing them to return to Syria. We must continue to try and free those who are trapped, to help those who are looking for their lost loved ones to receive the information they need, to assist those who are freed with the correct support that they need to move forward with their lives, and of course to pursue justice and accountability for these terrible things that are happening. I hope that we won't be here next year. Likelihood is that we will, and if we are, I hope we have still so much support from various countries, from the incredible work that's happening, and from the audience. I wish our state speakers and our civil society speakers and all of you who are working on these important issues luck and strength in your work over the next year. It's incredible work that you're all doing. Please pursue it. It is so needed. Thank you for your time and for your attention and for all of your efforts to help resolve these issues. Thank you very much.